For Biomedical Ethics and Humanities, and we're very pleased to see all of you here today. We're also happy that we have a speaker here today, given the iffiness of the winter weather and certain cycles of wintry precip, or the warnings about it, that seem to be coming on Tuesdays and Wednesdays this semester. Disturbs my sleep at night. But anyway, we're delighted to have a speaker and a program to bring you. Today's program is called Editorial Scalpels, Behind the Scenes with Narrative Matters and Health Affairs. Now, everyone loves a good story, from family circles and cozy pub partners to literature professors to policy wonks. Stories matter. Narrative, in the words of Richard Carney, who writes extensively about storying, narrative is someone telling something to someone about something. Narrative gives us a subjective point of view. It engages, even manipulates us, not only our intellect, but also our emotions. It seeks to persuade, to teach us, to change us, chiefly by providing an experience of living through, not just knowing about. And as we all know, stories stay with us. So what about narrative as a policy tool, as a change agent in the health policy arena? Since 1999, first-person tales told by doctors, patients, medical students, professors, and family members have made up the compelling Narrative Matters section of the premier health policy journal, Health Affairs. This section reminds readers that policy decisions have human consequences. Narrative Matters essays are widely read on Capitol Hill, and many have been republished in the Health and Science section of the Washington Post, and many have been broadcast on NPR. In this Medical Center Hour, Ellen Ficklen, who we're pleased to welcome, is the former editor of Narrative Matters. She takes us behind the scenes at the journal. In her time with us, she'll probe the close working relationship between authors and editors as manuscripts are sculpted and polished into powerful and memorable essays that sort of everyone's favorite surgeon author, Atul Gawande, has described as some of healthcare's most stunning writing. Ellen Ficklen was for 8 years the editor of Narrative Matters. She's been a writer all her life on subjects medical, policy, and otherwise. We found out last night she's also written frequently about food, including a book on watermelon. And if there's time in the discussion, if you want to go in that direction, you're welcome to. And finally, before welcoming her to the lectern, I will say that she completed a conflict of interest disclosure form, and there are no conflicts to disclose. So, welcome.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here at the Medical Center Hour and become a part of its venerable history. And my special thanks to Marcia and Danny Becker for inviting me. Health Affairs is a health policy journal that many of you know. Its authors are academics and researchers, and the journal is extremely serious, highly quantitative, and widely respected. It's wonky and proud of it. But then, in 1999, a section of Health Affairs was created that would differ radically from everything else in the journal. A first-person story section called Narrative Matters. For about 8 years, I edited the stories that ran there. That meant I solicited pieces, handled manuscripts from start to finish, spoke about Narrative Matters, even ran conferences sponsored by Narrative Matters. I'd like to tell you a bit about why this story section came about, what we wanted Narrative Matters essays to do, and how we got the compelling, thoughtful, and incredibly moving stories that were published in this section. I'll also touch a bit on one of the tricky issues involved with all medical narratives. Who does the story belong to? the person telling it, or the doctors and patients involved, or the readers. When the founding editor of Health Affairs, John Iglehart, created the Narrative Matters section, the goal was to nurture a form of health policy writing that would tell a true story, a first-hand encounter with the healthcare system. Each of these first-person narratives would also tie a specific personal story to a larger healthcare issue. After all, Health Affairs was a health policy journal. Over time, we began to use the phrase policy narratives to describe the essays. The stories in Narrative Matters have run the spectrum from incredibly personal to story-based philosophical ponderings with everything in between. Here are 3 examples. The Narrative Matters essay that Ron Capps wrote begins as his cell phone rings. He's in a pickup in Darfur, about to put a pistol to his head, just as his wife calls from the US. With disturbing honesty, Ron writes about what it's like to have post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. An overarching fear for him was that getting treatment would lead to losing his security clearance, and that would mean losing his job. Natalie Kelly's essay, The Other End of the Phone, is filled with phone calls. Now, I should probably note that not all Narrative Matters essays have phone calls in them, but there will be one more after this one. Natalie's a specially trained medical interpreter who does over-the-phone interpretations between Spanish-speaking patients and healthcare professionals. In the process, she becomes the invisible voice of both doctors and patients, gaining and giving readers new, insightful views of the U.S. healthcare system. In one of several Narrative Matters essays written by Professor of Pediatrics John Lantos, he ponders what he calls the disturbing realities of neonatal intensive care units. The fact that we care for these newborns so well, he argues, shouldn't mask that we need to attack the problem sustaining an epidemic of premature births in this country. These and other stories published in this section are fascinating. Among the names you might know of people who've written first-person stories for Narrative Matters: Pauline Chen, Fitzhugh Mullen, Julia Alvarez, Daniel Offrey, Alexander McCall Smith, Perry Klass, Victoria Sweet, Jane Pauley, and Abraham Verghese. Essays have been written by novelists, nonfiction authors, and Pulitzer Prize winners. They've been written by doctors, medical students, all kinds of healthcare professionals, patients' families, and patients, one of whom was a project manager at a construction company. But on the whole, and no matter how good the writer is, the manuscripts weren't ready to publish when they arrived. Especially as it's difficult, right off the bat, to come up with the right mix of personal story and healthcare policy that Narrative Matters essays are known for. So how did manuscripts that were okay to good become what the Washington Post called Ron Capps's PTSD manuscript? Stunningly good. Even earlier in the process, how did we figure out which submissions had the capacity to become stunningly good? Well, from the get-go, we knew we wanted to publish stories. That meant there were certain types of medical writing that would be fine elsewhere, but weren't what we wanted. No commentaries or editorials. A short anecdote at the beginning did not mean that it was a story. No case studies. No traditional illness narratives that dealt solely with the patient's story of being sick. Nothing that was overly clinical or packed with medical jargon. No traditional academic papers. And we really, really didn't want anything that used phrases like heuristic paradigm or metacritical insight. What were we looking for? A compelling story. A piece with a beginning, middle, and end that had a strong narrative arc connecting the parts. An insider's view showing something readers might not know, but that the writer knew intimately. A big picture message that tied to the personal story. By the way, if anyone here is interested in writing a Narrative Matters essay, you can find greater detail on what's wanted in the Narrative Matters section on the Health Affairs website at healthaffairs.org. And a tip. The current Narrative Matters editor, Jessica Bylander, tells me that she's especially looking for manuscripts dealing with vulnerable children. So how did a first-person story get into print as a Narrative Matters essay? What happened behind the scenes? When a manuscript submission arrived, I and another editor would read it to see if it was indeed a story, if that story interested us, and if there was a possible policy aspect to the story. A number of fine essays needed to be turned down at this point because they didn't have the potential to become the type of policy narrative that we published. Sometimes we'd be able to suggest another journal where the essay might be appropriate. If a manuscript made it through this first round, it was sent out to 3 peer reviewers. At least one reviewer was a subject matter expert on the medical situation in the manuscript. And we asked that person to help us vet or question the medical aspects of the story. At least one of the other reviewers was a writer or experienced critical reader. One of the several questions we asked of all the reviewers was that the manuscript presented a well-told story. We were always on the lookout for personal stories told so well that they qualified as or could become literary nonfiction. The Irish Anglo writer Edna O'Brien says that memoir must have the shimmer of fiction. That's a great way of putting it. We were looking for that shimmer. We might not always be able to define what shimmer meant, but we sure recognized shimmer in prose when we read it. The type of literary nonfiction we looked for was able to plunge readers into a world where they come to know the characters involved and care about what happens to them. One element, for instance, might be the use of telling details within a story. While talking with the family, did the doctor lean back against the wall or sit across from the mother, leaning forward? Whichever way the doctor was leaning, that detail helps illuminate what was going on. As an aside here, I want to state my strong preference for the term literary nonfiction rather than the more commonly used term creative nonfiction. Even though creative nonfiction has been defined as true stories well told, I found that far too many people interpret the word creative to mean that they have license to tinker with the facts in the nonfiction pieces. When that happens, creative nonfiction begins an odd kind of creepy drift into fiction. Someone's afraid a male colleague could be recognized in a piece. So presto changeo, reverse the sex, and suddenly there's a female cardiologist in the essay. No. Then it's no bunker true story, is it? I think the phrase literary nonfiction helps keep writers honest by better defining their goal. But what's the virtue of the Narrative Matters section of Health Affairs, publishing literary nonfiction policy narratives that shimmer. Storytelling is probably in our DNA. Stories are powerful. People want to read them. Many Health Affairs readers say that Narrative Matters is the first section they go to when a new issue of the journal comes out. And reader surveys consistently rank the first-person stories in that different section of the journal among its most read articles. They account for a huge number of hits and downloads on the Health Affairs website. And it turns out that shimmering literary nonfiction stories stay alive well after they've been published. They have an incredibly long shelf life. In 2006, Johns Hopkins University Press published some of the early essays in a collection called Narrative Matters: The Power of the Personal Essay in Health Policy. Narrative Matters essays are used in classrooms and go into best essay anthologies. The essays are recorded now too and available as podcasts on iTunes without charge. The print essays are also free from the Health Affairs website. National publications and blogs reference, link to, or republish Narrative Matters essays. National Public Radio has turned essays into on-air commentaries, and the Washington Post began republishing some of them in its weekly Health and Science section. But then Narrative Matters authors also began being interviewed about their stories on NPR's Diane Reeves show and Fresh Air with Terry Gross. They began being invited to speak at conferences, and several of the authors received book contracts after their Narrative Matters essays were published. A part of this popularity, apart from all that shimmering going on, is that the essays tackle important healthcare concepts through true stories about real people. One Narrative Matters essay begins this way: "Numbers never tell the whole story." That might well be a motto for the section. That's because underlying all of the undeniably important statistics and data involved in policy, stories illustrate the basic truth that health policy has human consequences. The Narrative Matters essays tell about those human consequences. And they direct the messages to the people who shape and make health policy. People on Capitol Hill read it. Senators, congresspeople, and their staff members read the journal. And if a Narrative Matters story touches the heart of a staffer, you can count on his or her boss reading it too. After a Narrative Matters essay by Paul Rubin described how, as a father, he found spare after-hours support in getting appropriate mental health treatment for his mentally ill son, one of the responses Health Affairs received was a letter about child mental health services. It came from Representative Henry Waxman, Democrat of California, and Senator Susan Collins, Republican of Maine. They wrote in closing, "We admire his courage in speaking out. Shame on our government if we do not listen." Michael Ogg is a severely disabled former physics professor. He wrote what was, in part, an ode to his personal care assistants, whose help allows him to continue living in his own home. In his Narrative Matters essay, he gave a clear-eyed, unflinching description of what a day in his life is like, including precisely how he goes to the bathroom. But his funds and long-term care insurance are running out. Medicare doesn't cover personal care assistance. So when his personal funds are depleted, he might, against his wishes, be forced to move to an institution. same month his essay was published, Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius gave a speech retelling Michael's Narrative Matters essay and calling for help for him and others in such situations. As a result of reading Narrative Matters essays, policymakers are touched and informed, and they often find themselves thinking about important healthcare issues in creative new ways. That's the point. That's the power of well-crafted stories. But to get back to how those stories come about, a manuscript came in and went through peer review. If there was consensus to move forward with the submission, then I'd send detailed review comments to the writer, usually with plenty of questions and suggestions. It was at that point that the manuscript would begin going through 1, 2, even 3 more drafts to evolve into a health policy narrative. Writing is a careful act of construction, points out editor and writing expert William Zinsser, to which I'd add that construction is a process. Depending on the piece, and each one was different, there might be emails, phone calls, sometimes writing coaching as it moved forward. This is where the editorial scalpels came into play. First, do no harm, I believe, is a rule for editors, just as it is for doctors. Even so, sometimes you can end up with a bit of blood on the floor. Getting to deep truths does that. And in the case of Narrative Matters, the stories were by people writing about what were often incredibly painful aspects of their own lives. Furthermore, their personal stories were often extremely personal. Then I'd ask the writers to make them even more personal, to dig deeper, to burrow under the surface, to keep thinking about what happened. How did you feel about it then? How do you feel about it now? How did your thinking evolve? And they did, with honesty and bravery. Their later drafts became richer, more nuanced, more engaged and thoughtful, more memorable, and sometimes far more raw and truthful as well. A former politician writing about his son's devastating mental illness, which eventually led to the son being imprisoned. He titled his essay, "How I Helped Create a Flawed Mental Health System That's Failed Millions and My Son." An 82-year-old New Yorker writing about what it's like to go blind in the increasingly inaccessible city she loves. A doctor writing about making a mistake that might have caused a child's death and telling the parents. I'm awed by how many Narrative Matters writers summon the ability to peel off yet another layer of skin and show us their pain and their strength in an effort to help make things different for others. In some cases, as part of the writer-editor partnership, I helped writers structure and deepen their stories. We worked on where to condense and where to expand. We worked on word choice. We figured out how best to organize the story. Amy Berman wrote one of the most widely read articles in all of Health Affairs in 2012. No small feat. I asked her last week if I could share part of the background of how her amazing Narrative Matters story developed. And she gave me permission. Its title, Living Life in My Own Way and Dying That Way as Well. Amy is a program officer at a health foundation who's received a diagnosis of terminal breast cancer. She's smart, she's informed, and with the help of a doctor who respects her goals, she's forgoing aggressive treatment in favor of active palliative care. Amy submitted a good manuscript, but we had some questions. One was how we could help readers know her better. Amy and I had several conversations in the course of editing her piece, and in one long one, I asked for details about how she'd heard about her terminal diagnosis. I already knew that she and her mother were walking down a street when she got a phone call telling her the news. This is the other phone call I said would be coming. But that's all she'd written about it. I asked her about the weather. What was she wearing? How exactly did she respond? What did she and her mother do and say? And Amy told me in her own natural, conversational way. Conversation, after all, was the first storytelling. We talked a lot, and it was a tough phone call for both of us. It was emotional. I know I teared up. After we talked, and using Amy's own words, I put together some paragraphs about when she learned her diagnosis. I shaped it, but it was all Amy. It was what she told me. Readers learned a great deal about her from that scene, so we decided to use it to start off her essay. Here's how it reads. The day I found out that I was terminally ill, it was misty, just barely raining. It was November 2010. I was 51 years old. My life was normal, wonderful in fact. My mother and I, both in our raincoats, both carrying umbrellas, were walking down a city sidewalk miles from home when my cell phone rang. It was my oncologist calling to give me test results. She knew I'd want them before a medical appointment the next day. She told me gently. I hung up. It's stage 4, I told my mother. The bone biopsy showed that the cancer has spread. It's in my lower spine. I paused. This is the worst case. It's bad. The diagnosis seemed to drop from the sky. Rain clouds turned to lead, crashing down on us. We hugged, crying, rain and salty tears mixing. My tiny mother, her tall daughter, one wet, rain-coated shade as we held one another, our umbrellas forgotten. Take 3 breaths, I finally managed to say to her. We tried. But as we inhaled, suddenly both of us began laughing, uncontrolled belly laughs, despite and in defiance of the damp death sentence that had just fallen from the sky. That was 18 months ago. Now in April 2012, the medical countdown toward the end of my life continues. And I've done a lot of thinking about how best to live the limited time I have left. I think that's a piece people want to keep reading. Part of an editor's job in a first-person story section is to ask a lot of questions. It can involve a type of tough love on occasion. You need to be touched by the story, yet be firm, as well as digging into it with kindness, and to keep digging until the piece is great. But there's also the responsibility to protect the writer. There's a phrase in DC political circles that sometimes would come into play with Narrative Matters essays. It's a bit indelicate, but here goes. Watch out for the asshole handles. What are they? They're the line, the phrase, the moment in a story that some asshole could latch onto and use to refocus the attention away from the point of the story. Part of my editing role was to find anything that might fit into that category, then make sure that the author rethought, recast, or even took out that line or section. Occasionally, if something in the manuscript seemed too private, I'd ask her, "Are you sure you want to tell that to everybody?" If it wasn't essential to the story, it didn't have to be there. Or take the time in a story when the author's wife was quoted making a snide comment to him. Was it okay with her to be quoted saying that in a national publication? We asked. It was. But that brings up the question of who owns the content of medical stories. The wife's snide comment is a good, really simple example of what can come into play. Would it be okay for the author to tell the story, not care about how his wife felt about being quoted from a private moment, and for us to publish it? Or does the wife own her comment? Did she need to give permission to use it? What if it had been a comment made by a patient rather than by the wife? Or does it make a difference if it had been said by any one of hundreds of unnamed patients, but the writer had only one wife? We struggled with a range of these kinds of issues as we published essays. And I hope to hear some of your thoughts on ownership, on medical narratives in the question and answer session. I'll tell you now, I think it's best to be very, very careful and to get as many permissions and signed release forms as possible. During the years I had edited 100+ Narrative Matters essays, I worked on amazing story after amazing story, with brave author after brave author. I delved into the writers' lives and often shared parts of mine. In the process, some of the authors became friends. We email and I get the occasional Christmas card. But the bottom line, it's really all about the stories. And they stand. They continue to affect readers and to get them thinking about health policies. You've heard part of what surgeon author Atul Gawande wrote. I'll read you the full quote. Narrative Matters showcases some of healthcare's most stunning writing. The stories are moving, eloquent, and often unforgettable. That was always the goal. Thank you for coming, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So thank you so much, and it's illuminating to hear the process that went on to craft some of these essays. And I and some other people in the audience here have in the past served as some of the critical readers and saw some of the incredible raw material that came in, and then equally incredibly the finished product that was the work behind the scenes room at Health Affairs. So we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So we'll start. Would you please identify?
Hi, thank you. That was really very enjoyable. My name is Karen Knight, and I'm in the medical library. I'm unclear as to how the health policy part gets interwoven, since I have not read one, but I intend to go immediately and read them all.
Oh, good.
But is that written by the originator, or is that written by someone else? And
it is by the originator, and that's part of the asking that to think about them further. One thing we'll also say to someone sometimes is after there's been an event that they want to tell us is to wait a year and think about it, where it's not too raw, too fresh. And then to think about a way to put it into context for other people. One, I remember somebody was saying, I'm not the only one that this has happened to. And then they go into some 3 million people, and they make it larger so they show how they fit into it. We've also written about orphan diseases, and something that's there is how difficult it is to get funding to get medications. So they would also bring in some information about how little funding, for instance, rather than just make sort of the blanket statement. And it would be very carefully selected pieces of data or statistics so that it still feels like a story, that it still feels as if somebody could say that to you.
Sure. Okay.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Engelhardt, and I teach health policy here in the School of Medicine, and I'm here today with my co-mentor, Eric Hewlett, and 7 of our first-year medical students.
Oh, terrific.
So my question is, and I realize you're not a physician, but my question is, in your observation, and particularly with the authors who were clinicians, how has the patient's story made them better physicians?
Yes, that's complicated. I think, first of all, there was the first cut comes when they wrote about it to begin with. There was something before they even submitted it to us that made them wanted to put it on paper and think about it a little more and continue to think about it. And it just seems to me if people realize, again, the human consequences, and imagine what if it were me? What if it was my mom? What if it was my sister? They begin thinking about things a little differently. I would think that would make people better physicians. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, about what that does?
I'm just struck by, in today's delivery system, I mean, most what I do is study about how it works and doesn't work, and all the pieces. And I'm just a little concerned about the time constraints in clinical medicine, and it makes the patient's story almost feel like an indulgence, where I think that probably it's just exactly the opposite.
Dan Becker from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities. I'm also a primary care doctor. I do palliative care. In addition to Narrative Matters, there's at least a half dozen other publications who want the national audience. So I think there's a growing phenomenon of people coming in a very personal way, and not just with literary nonfiction, but through fiction and stories about being sick and suffering. There's also a really large literature on the therapeutic benefits of writing and disclosing and recovering from trauma. So to help answer the second question, not only does it feel good to write about it, but it's healthy to write about it. And in controlled studies that have been replicated, one of the things that I love about this literature is that the health benefits are stronger based on the number of revisions the story goes through. As you take out your journal and you write about the trauma and you change point of view, and as it changes in time, you feel better about what you're doing.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Roberts. I'm one of those first-year medical students. I'm sure a question you get a lot, so I'll just ask it anyway. Which one of these narrative medicine stories that you've seen has been your favorite?
That is so hard.
Yeah.
Some of the ones I mentioned here, I like. I think the Ron Capps one about PTSD was particularly helpful because it was written with such honesty. And I had wanted to do a PTSD story. I wanted to find a PTSD story. And I had been sure it would probably be written by a doctor. And so to have one written by a patient who was willing to disclose what he was thinking, to talk about seeing psychiatrists, to say that I'm still on meds, all of that was just very strong. And it's been very good for Ron. I mean, you know, next thing he was being invited to speak at the Carter Center. And he has a book coming out this year. And he has gone on, and this is what I just love to see these things blossom. He has gone on to start a veterans writing project that is working with people at Walter Reed now. And they work with their families too, so that the family also has this feeling of writing. And it just helped give him the springboard he needed. And he had a great voice. I mean, that's the thing, is all these people are out there, and it's just people don't know how to pinpoint them or find them. And they're standing up and going, here's what I think. And then people can locate them.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, that one doesn't pick up.
All right.
There's some in the back, and yeah.
And thank goodness he had a wife who loved him and kept reaching out so that he would still be with us.
It really was a remarkable moment.
And people who read that story can hear that voice also in a larger narrative. Those of us that have been involved in the policy world fear the N of one and the consequence of the N of one.
Yes.
Hoping to have evidence-based policy rather than policy based on the individual.
And there's reason for that. No.
But when narrative takes on the voices of the larger community, even though it's from a personal point of view, it then speaks to a larger issue. So my question is, what of the narrative pieces that you've worked on do you think have directly led to new policies? And how has that voice of one really captured, as we say, rings a bell of honesty and truth and intention that needs to be attended to?
Let me back up a little bit to the N of one. That's one reason we use 3 peer reviewers. There were usually 2 peer reviewers for health affairs articles. And we really wanted our stories to be vetted up one side and down the other. You want to be sure that the story is really true. You want experts to look at it. You want to be able to ask questions. And you want to just know by the time it goes out there that this person was telling things with truth. And most people in these situations represented a larger group. So I think we never had trouble with any published story falling apart. And one of the things when we were talking about honesty with people was saying, imagine if you're at a congressional hearing and someone reads you part of your essay. Will it be true? Can you vouch for it? It's like, well, I sort of put this into this, and that didn't actually happen. You know, that's not what we were ever going to have. So it's hard to know specific effects. I mean, oddly enough, people forget to tell you that the story did something. You know, it would often come back to us later and say, oh, by the way, did you know that happened out of it? But I do think it gave examples that could be put forward. It's interesting with Michael Ogg, who's so severely disabled, they were going to have him come talk on Capitol Hill. And one of the things that was in the piece, but they missed, is that he was born in England. So when they interviewed him on the phone, here's this guy with this English accent. And they decided at the last minute they couldn't have an English accent testifying about the US healthcare system. So that's one we know that didn't go through. I would like to think things change slowly and that they all help in the change.
Hi, Darcy Lee, Medical Education. Ellen, do you ever allow stories, kind of piggybacking on Carolyn's comment, to circle back to you when you talk about, did it make someone a better doctor? Did it impact society or health policy? Do you ever let it circle back as a PS, as another article or follow-up?
We do. And I'm going to self-disclose. Darcy and I went to high school together. Although I didn't plant the question. Yes, in fact, we have had authors write more than one essay for us. And there's some that have written as many as 4. We call them frequent flyers. But they often report on what came out of it and how things happened and how their thinking has evolved. There was one essay that was called What Are We Going to Do with Dad? By Jerry Whittaker. And it was the longest essay we ever published. It was twice as long as normal. And we just did it. It was just such a good essay. And he is, he's a geriatrician who had an aging father where things were not going well. And he was very honest about it. And a part of his was wondering was if he saw his father fall, what would he do? Would he save his life at the stage his father was in? And you were with him to the last line of that. So when we had our 10th anniversary of Narrative Matters, at that point it was the most popular Narrative Matters ever published. We asked him to actually write a follow-up. That's the only time we asked specifically. And he was talking about all the things that had come out of that, the way thinking had evolved in the press, in his profession, and not in his profession. But I like to think a lot of these stories are going to come back again, one way or another. The issues don't die, but maybe they can get better.
I just kind of had a question pursuant to her question about the N of one issue. Obviously, narrative has a really powerful ability to move us, create empathy, and provoke a response, as you mentioned. But do you ever have stories come in that you feel are true and powerful, but maybe the response they would evoke isn't necessarily wise based on a larger sample or a broader view of the world?
I can't really think what that would be. We have on occasion done pro and con pieces in the same issue. Health Affairs does not take a stand on any health aspects. So it is one person's story each time, but that doesn't mean that we would have to agree or disagree. Is that enough of an answer? Is that what you meant?
Hi, my name is Arnav Sarkar. I'm also a first-year medical student. I think that speaking about health policy through stories is definitely an elegant way to talk about it, but I'm wondering about the different readership that Health Affairs has versus the popular press that has adopted some of the stories from Health Affairs. And I was wondering if you'd speak about the different reception you've gotten from readers in those two different outlets.
They have bigger subscriptions than we do. You know, the Washington Post is out there more. I will say that sometimes when they have republished or NPR does a commentary, they have to shorten them And they do tend to take a lot of the policy out and focus in just on the story. But, I mean, I've actually had the wonderful situation of being at a party and somebody start talking about something they just read about in the Post. And I'm like, that's our story. You know, no, it was about first, we did it, you know, kind of thing. So clearly, I mean, we'll talk about the issue at a party, it's getting out there, and that's wider than you're going to have in committee rooms. We really, health affairs has a very specific audience. So any way that we can just keep broadening the readership was something that we always looked for.
My name is Eric Hewlett. I'm also part of this team. It has been a delightful and informative and inspiring presentation. And I need to go and read some of these
You'll like
essays.
them.
Before we finish, I would like to hear about watermelons. My wife and I love watermelons. We have one in our refrigerator at home at the moment, despite the fact that it's February. And so we'd like to hear about whatever you can tell us about watermelons.
Okay, if you have another hour or so. I have somehow become the largest watermelon object collector in the U.S. I am queen of a very narrow sphere and field. But I don't really know how it started. I've done a lot of writing over the years, and I think it came out of doing some folklore pieces and different kind of things about folk art. And people at one point started giving me watermelons because of a story I had done. So you get to the point where you go, well, either I have to stop people doing this, or else I have to go with it. And I just kind of looked at them and I said, you know, they are so cheerful, and there's so many geometric shapes, and, you know, they just make people happy. So I started, and living in D.C., people go all around the world and bring you back things, and they're very proud of themselves, which is great because that keeps them doing it. But I did do a small book for the Library of Congress, American Folk Life Center, and after that, I just started getting phone calls, and the Cambridge World History of Food used me for other footnotes, and so it's occurred to me I should write a book, a really big coffee table book about watermelons. So that'll be one of my projects. And thanks for asking that.
I'm Greg Hayden, a general pediatrician. You've shared some beautiful stories with us. Some of them sound very serious, bring you to tears kind of stories. I'm curious if you've published any humor.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up because well, first of all, most narrative matter stories have something terrible going on. That's true. And there was always a joke in the office if somebody had to go to the hospital and have surgery. It was like, please, I hope this doesn't become a narrative matter story. You know, take care. But we had some that were very funny. And there was one, it was about a fellow whose mother was retired and driving him crazy. And he suddenly realized that she had been sort of an amateur actress in her youth, so he got her into a standardized patient program. It was a hoot. It was just very funny. But this is one of the stories where, you know, we looked at it and then we said to him, you know, your mother's still alive, right? And he goes, oh, yeah. We said, you didn't talk to your mother. There's nothing from your mother in here. So he went back, talked to his mother, got some great quotes, and the story just grew and got better. But it's a really heartwarming, funny kind of story.
Anybody else? Yes.
Hi, my name is Ju. I'm a graduate nursing student here. I have a question in general about the journal itself. Are there places in the journal where healthcare professionals can go together and publish a post about maybe policies in general and their thoughts about what needs to be changed or anything like that, just to sort of talk about policy and how we can...
The most accessible section for that is that there's a blog that does take outside contributors, and it gets very widely read. But traditionally it would be sort of an academic paper that a group of people might do. And there have been some sort of lighthearted papers as well, but it's still sort of the traditional academic paper. I don't know of a lot of group authorship places. I would try the blog.
One last one. So health affairs is wonky. Do you think narrative manners has humanized your wonky readers? In terms of bringing them the more human side of what they do in terms of their work on a day-to-day basis?
I sure hope so. I think so. I mean, the fact that people read it first says that there's some kind of appeal, and it's a way to slide people into health policy and still be cerebral. Yes, I'd say yes.
Good. Yeah, I think one of the other, like some of the most effective pieces I've read have involved persons writing about having inhabited a role that isn't their usual role. So a physician who's a family member and whose family member is ill and in the hospital with some serious problems, and the physician is suddenly having to in a sense, take off the white coat and be the family member, or is caught between still being the physician and being the family member, and to imaginatively go there, I think for health professionals, to put on, that other being, that these essays have been really valuable in that way. And I think in that way, some of those people are writing about the way their own experiences have changed them as professionals as well.
Right, and I think with those stories, they often show how they move beyond the knee-jerk. The very last piece I edited ran in December 2012. It's by Jonathan Welch, and the title is As She Lay Dying. He's an amazing man, and he wrote quite an amazing piece, but he was an emergency medicine physician in Boston, and he suddenly got a phone call that his mother had just been rushed to the hospital in the Midwest, so he goes there. He never discloses the state or the name of the hospital, but there were at least 2 egregious medical errors. And he's arriving there at night, and she has an infection, and there is just only so much time. And it's what he does against the clock, trying to get her the treatment that he knows she needs. And she does. And then what he and his family opt to do is an equally strong part of the story, because they begin trying to work with the hospital and set up a family council. But the way he tells it, the person he is, the way it concludes, the hospital was not good. I mean, somebody said they were sorry as an aside once. But it's gotten him involved in patient councils in Boston. But I think it's that he might never have grown in that direction if he hadn't have been the kind of person he was and had such a sad, terrible thing happen. And that's what he could think of as to best honor his mother and his profession.